The last time Roan Hadley spoke to his father, he was standing in the rain outside their family estate on Earth, holding a single bag over his shoulder while the front door closed behind him. That was 8 years ago. He had not been back since. Now he was on his knees in the dirt of an unnamed moon, brushing dust off a stone tablet that was older than human civilization. The air was thin up here. The portable shelter behind him rattled every time the wind picked up. His ration packs were running low, and the research grant that paid for this dig would expire in 2 months. None of that mattered. What mattered was the tablet under his fingers and the strange symbols carved into its surface. Roan had chosen this life, not because it was easy, but because it was his. When he was 18, his father had given him a choice: join the diplomatic academy, carry the Hadley name into Galactic Union politics, and become the obedient son the family needed, or leave. Roan had chosen to leave. His father called him ungrateful. His mother said nothing. His younger brother Colton looked at the floor and stayed silent. The door closed, and Roan Hadley became nobody. He had spent the years since then building himself back up from nothing. He studied xenoarchaeology at a low-ranking university on a scholarship. He took jobs no one else wanted, cataloging ruins on dead worlds, digging through alien rubble in freezing temperatures, sleeping in cargo bays of transport ships because he could not afford a cabin. It was lonely work, but it was honest, and it was his. The sound of an engine broke through the silence of the moon. Roan looked up and saw a Union survey ship descending through the pale sky. He frowned. No one was supposed to be here. This dig site was registered under his grant, and he had not requested any support. The ship landed 100 meters from his shelter. The hatch opened, and a tall figure in a Union administrative uniform stepped out. He was an older man with gray hair and a calm face. He introduced himself as Director Perros from the Union's Office of Cultural Exchange. Roan stood up and wiped the dirt from his hands. He asked what a cultural exchange director was doing on an empty moon. Perros studied him for a moment, then asked if Roan had undergone a medical scan recently. Roan said yes. Every dig worker was required to get one before starting a new contract. It was routine. Perros told him it was not routine this time. The scan had flagged something in his blood, a genetic marker that matched an ancient royal bloodline belonging to the Dreven Dominion. Roan stared at him. He knew the Dreven by reputation. Everyone did. They were one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. Their kingdom had once ruled half the known systems before retreating into isolation centuries ago. They were proud, ancient, and powerful, and they had nothing to do with humans. Roan told Perros there had to be a mistake. He was human, fully human, born on Earth to 2 human parents. There was no alien blood in his family. Perros nodded slowly and said that was what made it so remarkable. The marker was buried deep in his DNA, dormant for what appeared to be thousands of years. The Dreven had been searching for this specific genetic signature for over 3 centuries. Their civilization depended on it. Something called the Heartstone, a sentient crystal beneath their capital city, had gone dormant when the last carrier of this bloodline died. Without it, their entire world was slowly failing. Roan felt the ground shift under him, though nothing had actually moved. He asked the obvious question. Could he just say no? Perros was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the Dreven had made a formal request through the Galactic Union. They were asking for Roan by name. The Union considered it a matter of galactic diplomatic importance. Technically, Roan could refuse, but the weight of what that refusal would mean hung in the air between them. Roan looked back at his dig site, the tablet he had been carefully uncovering, the shelter with its rattling walls, the quiet, simple life he had built for himself out of nothing. He had spent 8 years proving that he did not need anyone. He did not need his father's name or his family's money or anyone's approval. He had survived on his own, and that survival was the only thing he was proud of. And now the galaxy was telling him that his blood belonged to someone else's story. He asked Perros how long the trip to the Dreven throne world would take. Perros said 3 days by Union fast transit. Roan nodded. He went back to his shelter, packed his one bag, and sealed the dig site. He did not look back at the tablet. He did not say goodbye to the moon dot on the ship, Perros gave him a data file about the Dreven Dominion. Roan read in silence. Their throne world was called Amarath. Their cities were carved from living crystal. Their technology was ancient beyond comprehension. And their people believed that the Heartstone was the soul of their civilization. Without it, they were just a kingdom waiting to die. Roan closed the file and leaned back in his seat. He stared at the ceiling of the ship and thought about his father. David Hadley, the great ambassador, who had thrown his own son away because he was not useful. And now, somehow, that same thrown-away son was being called to save a civilization that was older than Earth itself. He closed his eyes. He did not feel chosen. He did not feel important. He just felt tired. But he had learned a long time ago that the universe did not care how you felt. It only cared about what you did next. Amarath looked like a dream someone had forgotten to wake up from. The cities rose out of the ground in sweeping curves of pale crystal, their towers reaching so high they disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. Rivers of soft light ran beneath the streets like veins, pulsing faintly, though Roan could tell even from the air that the light was weak. Dying almost. The forests beyond the capital were made of stone trees with translucent leaves that should have been glowing but were instead dark and still. Everything on this world was beautiful, and everything was fading. The transport ship landed on a wide platform at the edge of the capital. Roan stepped out carrying his single bag and squinted against the pale sunlight. The air smelled like cold metal and something floral he could not name. A delegation was waiting for him. High Chancellor Savin stood at the front. He was old, even by Dreven standards. His silver-streaked eyes were deep-set and tired, and the lines on his pale face told the story of a man who had spent too many decades carrying a burden no one else could share. Behind him stood a row of Dreven nobles in formal robes, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open hostility. Roan noticed the hostility first. It was hard to miss. Savin stepped forward and greeted him in accented but clear English. He welcomed Roan to Amarath and thanked him for answering their call. His voice was warm, but the warmth was careful, measured. Roan nodded and said it was an honor. He meant it, even if he was not sure yet what any of this would become, that a younger Dreven woman stepped out from behind the delegation. She had sharp features and dark silver hair, pulled back tightly. Her name was Naya, and she was introduced as a scholar and historian who would serve as Roan's guide during his time on Amarath. She shook his hand with a grip that was firm and brief. Her eyes studied him the way someone might study an artifact they were not yet sure was genuine. Naya led him through the capital on foot. The streets were wide and quiet. Dreven citizens watched from windows and doorways as the human walked past. Some whispered. Some simply stared. Roan kept his eyes forward and his pace steady. He had been stared at before. On every alien world he had ever worked, he was the outsider. He knew how to carry that weight without flinching as they walked. Naya explained what the Heartstone was. It was not just a power source. It was alive in its own way. A massive sentient crystal buried deep beneath the capital, connected to every system on the planet through a network of crystal veins that ran for thousands of kilometers. When it was awake, it powered everything. The lights, the shields, the communication arrays, the environmental systems that kept Amarath habitable. When the last true-blooded heir died 300 years ago, the Heartstone went silent. Since then, the Dreven had been running on backup systems and stored energy, and all of it was running out. Roan asked what would happen if the Heartstone was not reawakened. Naya was quiet for a moment. Then she said that within a generation, Amarath would become uninhabitable. The crystal forests would die completely. The cities would go dark. The Dreven would become refugees in a galaxy that had already moved on without them. That evening, Roan was brought before the Noble Council in a chamber that felt more like a cathedral than a government building. The ceiling was impossibly high, and the walls were lined with carved crystal panels that depicted scenes from Dreven history going back tens of thousands of years. Roan stood in the center of the room, while 24 nobles looked down at him from raised seats. Most of them did not hide their feelings. One noble, a tall woman with cold eyes, stated plainly that allowing a human to touch the Heartstone would be a desecration of their most sacred tradition. Another argued that the genetic match had to be an error. A third suggested that even if the match was real, a human mind could not survive the bonding. Better to let the Heartstone stay dormant than to defile it with alien hands. Savan listened to all of them. Then he stood and spoke. He said he understood their concerns. He shared many of them. But the Heartstone had not responded to any Dreven candidate in 300 years. They had tested thousands. They had searched every colony, every outpost, every bloodline. None had carried the marker. This human did. And the oldest law of the Dominion was clear. The Heartstone chose its heir. Their feelings about the species of that heir did not change the law. The chamber fell silent. The nobles did not agree, but they did not challenge Savan further. Not yet. After the session, Naya walked Roan back to his quarters. She asked him if he was all right. Roan said he was. She asked if the hostility bothered him. Roan thought about it for a moment. Then he said that he had been told he was not good enough before, by people who were supposed to love him, strangers saying it was easier to handle. Naya looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, but was close to it. She said nothing else, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. The city around them pulsed faintly with its dying light, waiting for something it had not felt in 3 centuries. Roan set his bag down in the small, beautiful room they had given him. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. The same hands that had spent years digging through ruins and alien dust. The same hands his father had never once held. Tomorrow, they would begin testing his blood. Tomorrow, he would find out if the Heartstone recognized him. But tonight, he just sat in the quiet of an ancient world and let himself feel how strange it was to be wanted by a civilization that did not even like him. The needle went into his arm for the 14th time that week. Roan did not flinch anymore. The Dreven medical scholars had taken more blood from him in 7 days than he thought his body could spare, but they kept finding reasons to take more. Every sample revealed something new, something that made them whisper to each other in their own language with expressions that shifted between awe and discomfort. Naya sat across the room during most of the sessions, reading from old texts on a crystal tablet and occasionally translating when the scholars forgot to speak English. She had become a steady presence in his days. Not warm exactly, but reliable. She showed up when she said she would. She answered his questions honestly. For someone who had spent 8 years mostly alone, that consistency meant more than she probably knew. On the 8th day, High Chancellor Savan called Roan and the senior scholars to a private meeting in the archives beneath the Capitol. The archives were older than the city above them. The walls were raw crystal, uncarved and rough, and the air was cool and still. Savan stood beside a holographic display that showed 2 genetic maps side by side. One was Dreven, the other was Roan's. The lead scholar, an elderly Dreven named Orith, explained what they had found. Thousands of years ago, long before humans had discovered space travel, a Dreven exploration vessel had been lost during a deep-range survey mission. The ship was never recovered. The crew was listed as dead. But the genetic evidence now told a different story. At least one survivor had reached Earth. That survivor had lived among early humans, had children, and had passed the royal bloodline into humanity's gene pool. It had stayed dormant for millennia, buried so deep in human DNA that no standard scan would have caught it. It was only because the Union had recently upgraded its medical scanners to detect ancient alien biomarkers that Roan's blood had been flagged at all. The room was silent for a long time after Orth finished speaking. Savan stood with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the 2 genetic maps glowing in the dim light. Roan watched the faces of the scholars around him. Some looked fascinated. Others looked like they had swallowed something bitter. Naya broke the silence. She said that this meant the Dreven royal bloodline had survived not because of anything the Dreven had done, but because of humans. Because a species they had always dismissed as young and primitive had unknowingly carried the most important genetic legacy in Dreven history inside their own bodies for thousands of years. One of the younger scholars muttered something in Dreven. Naya shot him a sharp look, and he went quiet. Roan did not ask what he said. He did not need to. Over the next few days, the news spread through the capital. Roan could feel the shift in the way people looked at him. Before, it had been skepticism. Now, it was something more complicated. Some Dreven watched him with a grudging curiosity. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if looking at him would force them to accept something they were not ready to accept. Roan did not push. He did not demand respect or understanding. Instead, he did what he had always done. He worked. He asked Naya to help him access the historical archives, and he spent hours reading about Dreven culture, their traditions, their art, their language. He studied the way they built their cities and the songs they sang during their seasonal ceremonies. He asked questions not to impress anyone, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. One evening, there was a formal dinner hosted by the Noble Council. Roan attended in borrowed clothes that did not quite fit him right. He sat at the end of a long table and ate food he did not recognize with utensils he had to watch others use before he could figure them out. Halfway through the meal, a young Dreven servant carrying a tray stumbled and spilled water across the table and onto Roan's lap. The room went silent. The servant froze. The nobles watched with sharp eyes, waiting to see how the human would react. In Dreven culture, a servant embarrassing a guest of honor was a serious failure. The servant's face was pale with fear. Roan picked up a cloth from the table and started wiping the water off the surface. Then he looked at the servant and told him it was all right. Accidents happen. He said it calmly, with a small smile, and went back to eating as if nothing had happened. The servant bowed quickly and left. The nobles exchanged glances. Naya, sitting a few seats away, watched Roan with an expression that was hard to read. Later, when she walked him back to his quarters, she told him that what he did was noticed. Not just by her, but by everyone. Roan shrugged and said he did not do it to be noticed. He just did not see the point in making someone feel small for a mistake. Naya stopped walking. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression changed. The distance she had kept between them since the first day seemed to close by a fraction. She said that the Dreven had a word for the kind of strength that did not need to prove itself. She said it translated roughly as quiet weight. She told him he carried it well. Roan did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and said good night. That night, far away on Earth, Ambassador David Hadley sat in his office watching a news broadcast. The anchor was reporting that a human had been identified as the potential heir to the Dreven Dominion. The name Hadley appeared on screen. David stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his communicator and began making calls. The son he had thrown away was suddenly the most important human in the galaxy. And David Hadley was not the kind of man who let an opportunity like that pass him by. The diplomatic shuttle landed on Amarath with the kind of polished precision that only came from having a professional crew and an unlimited budget. Roan watched it from a balcony high above the landing platform. The hatch opened, and his father stepped out first, wearing a tailored gray suit and the kind of confident smile that had won him elections and trade deals across 3-star systems. Behind him came Colton, taller than Roan remembered, with the same sharp jaw and careful posture their father had drilled into both of them since childhood. But a swarm of Union media drones hovered nearby, capturing every angle. David Hadley raised his hand in greeting to the cameras, and Roan could almost hear the rehearsed sincerity in his voice from 300 meters away. Naya stood beside Roan on the balcony. She had learned enough about his past by now to understand what this arrival meant. She asked him if he wanted to leave before they reached the main hall. Roan shook his head. Running from his father had never solved anything. It had only delayed the conversation. David addressed the Dreven welcoming party with the smooth grace of a career diplomat. He spoke about the historic bond between humanity and the Dreven Dominion. He spoke about pride. He spoke about family. He called Roan his son 3 times in under a minute. The Dreven nobles listened politely. Savin stood to the side and said nothing, but his silver eyes tracked David the way a scholar tracks a sentence that does not quite add up. That afternoon, David requested a private meeting with Roan. It was held in a small chamber off the main hall, just the two of them. No cameras, no staff. David sat down across from Roan and studied him the way he always had, like a project that needed evaluation. He started by saying that Roan looked well, that 8 years had changed him, that he was glad to see his son again, The words were smooth, but they landed on Roan like stones dropped into still water, each one creating a ripple he had to hold still against. Then David got to the point. He said this situation was bigger than either of them. A human becoming heir to the Dreven Dominion would reshape galactic politics for a generation. The Hadley name would be attached to that legacy. It was an opportunity that could elevate their entire family and, by extension, all of humanity's standing in the Union. That he told Roan that all he needed to do was simple. Stand beside the family publicly. Use the Hadley name. Let David manage the diplomatic side. In return, David would formally welcome Roan back. The disownment would be erased. Roan would have his family again. Roan listened to every word without interrupting. When his father finished, there was a pause that stretched longer than either of them expected. Then Roan spoke. He said that for the first 2 years after he was thrown out, he slept in cargo bays. He ate 1 meal a day because that was all he could afford. He got sick on a mining colony and lay in a free clinic for a week with no one to call. He rebuilt his life piece by piece, alone, with nothing but his own hands and a stubbornness that he probably inherited from the man sitting across from him. He said he did not need to be welcomed back. He had not been waiting at the door. The family that threw him out when he was useless did not get to claim him now that he was valuable. David's expression changed. The diplomatic mask cracked just enough to show something underneath. Frustration, maybe even a flash of guilt, though it disappeared quickly. He leaned forward and said that Roan was making a mistake, that refusing to align with the family would make political enemies he could not handle alone. Roan told him he had been alone for 8 years. He could handle it. David stood up. He straightened his suit. He looked at Roan one more time, and for a moment, something human passed between them. Not love, not understanding, just the raw recognition that they were too different to ever stand in the same room without one of them breaking. David left without another word. Later that evening, Colton found Roan sitting on a bench in one of the crystal gardens near the guest quarters. The garden was quiet, lit by the faint glow of the stone trees. Colton sat down beside him without asking permission. He did not start with politics or strategy. He started with an apology. He said he was sorry. He said he should have spoken up 8 years ago when their father closed the door. He said he had been a coward, and he had spent every year since then knowing it. Roan looked at his younger brother. Colton's face was not polished right now. It was raw and uncertain, and it reminded Roan of the boy he used to be before their father shaped him into a copy of himself. Roan told him that sorry was a start, but it was not enough yet. Trust was not something you could rebuild with one conversation. Maybe someday they could get there, but not today. Colton nodded. He did not argue. He sat there for a while longer, and then he stood up and walked away quietly. Roan stayed in the garden alone. The crystal trees hummed faintly around him, their light dim but steady. Tomorrow was the bonding ritual. Tomorrow he would walk into the deepest chamber beneath this ancient city and place his hands on a crystal that had been sleeping for 300 years. He did not know if it would accept him. He did not know if he would survive it, but he knew one thing. Whatever happened down there, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else in his life. Alone, steady, and without pretending to be anything he was not. The chamber was deeper underground than Roan had expected. The descent took nearly 20 minutes through spiraling stone corridors that grew colder and quieter with every step. The walls here were raw, unpolished crystal, and they did not glow. Whatever light had once run through them had gone out long ago. Dreven guards lined the corridors in ceremonial armor, standing perfectly still with their silver eyes forward. None of them looked at Roan as he passed. Naya walked beside him until they reached the final staircase. Beyond it was a massive arched doorway carved with symbols so old that even the Dreven historians could only guess at their meaning. She stopped and told him this was as far as she could go. Only the one being tested could enter the Heartstone chamber. Roan looked at her. Over the past 2 weeks, she had gone from a skeptical stranger to the closest thing he had to a friend on this world. She had never once lied to him. She had never once been cruel. He told her thank you, and he meant it for more than just the translation work. Naya held his gaze for a moment. Then she said something in Dreven. He did not understand the words, but the tone was clear. It was the kind of thing you say to someone before they walk into something they might not walk out of. Roan turned and descended the final staircase alone. The Heartstone chamber was vast. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the floor was smooth black stone that reflected nothing. In the center of the chamber, rising from the ground like a frozen mountain, was the Heartstone itself. It was enormous, twice the height of any building Roan had ever stood in. Its surface was dark gray, covered in fine cracks and centuries of dust. There was no light in it at all. It looked dead, above ground, across the capital and across the entire planet. The Dreven watched through holographic projections. Thousands of them. Millions, Meb, in homes and public squares and council chambers. High Chancellor Savin watched from the ceremonial balcony above the chamber entrance. The noble council watched with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to grim expectation of failure. David Hadley watched from a viewing room reserved for foreign dignitaries, his face carefully composed. Colton stood behind him, his eyes fixed on the projection, his hands clenched at his sides. Roan walked across the black stone floor. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The air was cold and heavy, like the inside of a tomb. He could feel the weight of the crystal ahead of him, not physically, but somewhere deeper, like a pressure against his chest that grew stronger with every step. He reached the base of the Heartstone and stood there for a moment, looking up at the massive structure. He thought about all the people watching. He thought about the Dreven who hated the idea of a human standing where he stood. He thought about his father, who only cared about what this moment could give him. He thought about the servant who spilled water on him and the old chancellor who stayed up late worrying about his dying world. Then he stopped thinking. He placed both hands flat against the surface of the Heartstone. Nothing happened. Seconds passed. The silence pressed in. Somewhere above, a noble exhaled. Someone muttered that they had known this would fail. Then the stone vibrated. Not with light, with sound. A deep, resonant hum that started so low Roan felt in his bones before he heard it in his ears. It rose slowly, building like a wave, spreading outward from the point where his hands touched the crystal. The dust on the surface began to tremble and fall away in thin sheets. The hum became a tone. The tone became a chord. The chord became something that did not have a name in any language Roan knew. It was not music exactly. It was closer to a voice. As if the Heartstone was speaking for the first time in 300 years, and it had so much to say that it could only say it all at once. Light erupted from beneath his hands. Not the faint, dying glow that the crystal veins of Amarath had been producing for centuries. This was bright, blinding. It shot downward through the base of the Heartstone and into the floor, racing along the crystal veins that ran beneath the planet's surface. Across the capital, the streets lit up. The stone trees in the crystal forests flickered and then blazed with light. Systems that had been dark for 300 years powered on. Communication arrays crackled to life. Environmental shields hummed with sudden energy. The entire planet shuddered, not with destruction, but with something that felt like waking up. In the chamber, the light consumed Roan. It poured through him, through his blood, through whatever ancient code was written in his DNA that the Heartstone recognized as its own. For a single moment, he felt everything. The planet, the cities, the forests, the millions of lives above him. He felt them the way you feel your own heartbeat. Close, constant, alive. Then the surge became too much. His body could not hold it. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the base of the Heartstone. The light continued to pulse, but Roan was on the ground, unconscious, his hands still touching the crystal. Naya was the first one through the chamber doors. She ran across the black stone floor and knelt beside him. His pulse was faint but steady. Dreven healers followed seconds later, carrying equipment that glowed with the Heartstone's newly restored energy. They stabilized him on the chamber floor while the crystal above them sang its ancient, wordless song. Roan did not wake up for 2 days. When he finally opened his eyes, he was in a quiet room filled with soft light. Savin was sitting beside his bed, watching him with those tired silver eyes. The old chancellor looked different now. Not younger, but lighter. as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally been set down. Savin told him the Heartstone had accepted him fully. By the oldest laws of the Dominion, Roan was now the rightful heir. Roan stared at the ceiling. Then he asked, quietly, if the people would accept a human heir. Savin was honest. He said many would not. Not at first. But the Heartstone had chosen, and the Heartstone had never been wrong. Roan closed his eyes. He said he never asked for any of this. Savin nodded slowly and said that the best rulers never do. 3 weeks after the Heartstone awakened, Ambassador David Hadley stood behind a podium on Earth and told the galaxy that he had always believed in his son. The cameras captured his steady voice and his proud expression. He spoke about sacrifice and family and the values he had instilled in Roan since childhood. It was, by every measure, a flawless performance that IT lasted exactly 4 days that a journalist from a union news network pulled the public records. The formal disownment filing. The legal separation of assets. The official statement David had released 8 years ago declaring that Roan Hadley was no longer affiliated with the Hadley family in any personal or professional capacity. The journalist published the full timeline alongside David's recent press conference, and the contrast was devastating. David tried to control the story. He gave interviews. He called in favors. He used every political tool he had sharpened over decades of diplomatic work. But the facts were too clean and too public. The galaxy saw a father who had thrown away his son and then tried to claim credit when that son became the most important human alive. David Hadley's reputation, the one thing he had valued above everything else, began to fracture. Colton watched it all from a quiet apartment on Earth. He had stopped attending his father's events. He had stopped answering calls from the diplomatic staff. He sat alone one evening, staring at a blank message screen for nearly an hour before typing 2 words and sending them to Roan's personal channel. The message said, "I'm proud that on Amarath, life was changing." The Heartstone's energy pulsed through the planet like blood through a body that had been holding its breath for 3 centuries. The crystal forests glowed at night for the first time in living memory. Children who had never seen the stone trees lit up stood at the edges of the forest with wide eyes, reaching out to touch leaves that hummed with warmth. The ancient communication networks came back online, reconnecting Dreven colonies that had been cut off for generations. Engineers who had spent their entire careers patching failing systems now watched those systems run at full power, smooth and steady, as if they had never stopped. The Galactic Union did not know what to make of it. A human, a disowned archaeologist who had been digging through ruins on a forgotten moon, was now the heir to the oldest kingdom in the galaxy. Diplomats scrambled to adjust their strategies. Trade delegations requested meetings. Military analysts quietly recalculated power balances. The Dreven Dominion, which had been slowly fading from relevance for centuries, was suddenly the most important civilization in the galaxy again. And at the center of all of it was a man who did not want a throne. Roan did not hold a coronation. He asked Savin to delay any formal ceremony indefinitely. Savin raised an eyebrow, but agreed. Instead of speeches and rituals, Roan walked. He walked through the streets of the capital every day, visiting neighborhoods and markets and small workshops where ordinary Dreven lived and worked. He introduced himself by name, not by title. He asked people about their lives, their families, their trades. He sat with elderly Dreven who remembered the last days of the Heartstone's light and listened to their stories without interrupting. Some people were suspicious of him. Some were cold. A few turned their backs when he approached. Roan did not push. He came back the next day and the day after that. He did not demand acceptance. He simply showed up again and again and let people decide for themselves. One morning, he visited a school at the edge of the capital. The children stared at him with open curiosity. One small girl asked him why he looked different from everyone else. Roan knelt down to her level and said it was because he came from a different world. She asked if that made him sad. He thought about it and told her that it used to. But now he was learning that home was not always the place you came from. Sometimes it was the place that chose you. The teacher standing nearby wiped her eyes and looked away. Naya continued to walk with him through the city most days. She had stopped keeping the formal distance she had maintained at the beginning. She still corrected his pronunciation when he tried to speak Dreven, and she still rolled her eyes when he confused traditional greetings, but there was warmth underneath it now. A familiarity that had grown slowly, the way real things always did. One evening, they walked through the crystal forest on the outskirts of the capital. The trees glowed softly around them, their translucent leaves casting patterns of light on the ground that shifted with every breeze. The air smelled like cold stone and something sweet that Roan had never been able to identify. Naya told him that the Dreven word for air did not translate directly into English. It did not mean ruler or king or sovereign. The closest translation was the one who remembers. It described a person who carried the history of the people inside them. Not just the facts and dates, but the weight of it. The responsibility of making sure that nothing was forgotten. Roan thought about that for a long time as they walked in silence. That night, he stood alone on a balcony overlooking the capital. The city stretched out below him, glowing with the Heartstone's light. Towers of pale crystal reached toward the sky. Rivers of soft light pulsed through the streets. The stone trees in the distance shimmered like a second sky, turned upside down. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and it was alive because of something that had been sleeping in his blood since before his species had learned to build fire. He was not triumphant. He was not vengeful. He did not think about his father or the years of loneliness or the cargo bays he had slept in. He thought about the servant who spilled water and the old chancellor who never gave up and the little girl who asked him if being different made him sad. He had spent his whole life being told he was not enough. Not ambitious enough for his father. Not important enough for his family. Not alien enough for the Dreven. But standing here, in a kingdom that had chosen him not for his name or his politics, but for what he carried in his blood and proved through his character, Roan understood something he had never been able to see before. He was always enough. The universe just needed time to catch up.